Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Peter Tabuns. I'm the MPP for Toronto-Danforth, and I want to welcome you to our webinar about the state of truth and reconciliation in Canada. I want to, I'll start off, frankly, with the land acknowledgement, and then we'll go on to the background and the agenda for this evening. The land acknowledgement this evening will be given by Michael Chena, who's a First Nations activist resident in the Toronto-Danforth riding. I appreciate his willingness to join us this evening. Michael, if I could turn it over to you.
Thanks for the introduction. My name is Michael Chena. I'm a residential school survivor. I traveled with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for 4 years. I attended 2 residential schools from 1958 to 1968. I grew up in a Cree community on Treaty 9 territory along the shores of James Bay, formerly known as Rupert's Land. So I'll begin with the land acknowledgement for the territory. We would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Bell Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. The territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, the meeting place of Toronto, from the Haudenosaunee word Takaranto, is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island.
Michael, thank you very much. And good evening, everyone. To those who have joined us, I'm glad you're able to come to the webinar this evening. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They produced a final report on the history of the residential schools in Canada and made 94 recommendations for addressing the legacy of those schools and for addressing the needed repair to damage that they made. Tomorrow, we'll observe the first federal statutory holiday meant to be a day of reflection and commemoration of those who were lost. And it's meant to be a day of reflection, a day of memorial. And certainly in the last year, with the revelations of the graves of the lost children, there's been a real shock to Canadians. This event that seems so distant has been made to feel so much closer for so many. Truth and Reconciliation Commission produced 6 volumes of findings and 94 recommendations to address the genocide, to start finding the truth and bringing about reconciliation. I'm very pleased tonight to have as guests MPP Sol Mamakwa and MPP Suze Morrison. Sol is the NDP critic for Indigenous and Treaty Relations. He's also the member of the Standing Committee on Finance and Economic Affairs. Suze Morrison is the critic for urban Indigenous issues and critic for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls response. She's also a member of the Standing Committee on Justice Policy. Tonight we have a very simple format. I will not be speaking much. I'm going to be asking Sol and Suze to make introductory remarks. I will ask them some initial questions, and then we'll be taking questions from the audience. I want to note that if you want to pose a question, please use the question and answer feature of Zoom. The chat will be disabled. And with that, I think we should get into it. Sol, if I could ask you to speak first. Sol, there you are.
Yes, thank you. I just had my mic off, so good evening, everyone. Thank you, Peter, for inviting me. Thank you, Michael, telling us your background, and also acknowledging the land that we're on. It's good to see Suze as well, my colleague. And it's a day today being on the eve of Orange Shirt Day and a National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. You start thinking about the people, the children, our ancestors that never came home. And and then not only that, you start to think about some of the issues that we face as as Indigenous people. I know that certainly truth is very important, and I think I did a couple of interviews today, and and one of the things that they asked me was, can you share your experience as a residential school survivor? And I never called myself a survivor. I never acknowledged it. And the media people I was talking to today, and can you share some of that? And I shared some of it. And I've never really talked about it. And I think, I never was even open about it. During that time, I never, when I went, you didn't know that it was a residential school until later. And the things that were done, the things that I saw were, I guess, you just think that just the way things are, that's just how we think, how things work. But I think it's important to note that what happened in residential school and these schools, was, genocide. I say that because, the things that I saw, and I know that, there's a group out of Anishinaabe Nation that put out, how the rules were enforced in Indian residential schools. And it's about truth, right? Truth can change public policy, truth telling stories. And for anybody that's here, I'm just warning you, some of the stuff like they just outlined this, I just seen this earlier before I came in. So below are some of the documented ways the Indian residential school staff ensured students respected the rules that were there. I'm not going to read all of them. Starvation. Leather strap used to hit on various bodies, various areas of the body. Beating with fists. Inflicting beatings until unconscious, being unconscious. Shaming. Public beatings of naked children. Public strip search. Locking in closet cages and basements. I didn't read them all, but all I'm saying is that that is the truth. And I think, when we talk about admission of error, when we talk about past mistakes that was done to our people, just admitting it is not good enough. It's not sufficient. We need to be able to have a genuine and an honest process to right the wrongs. One of the things I also know is that we never agreed to lose our spirituality. One of the things I've known over the years and here is the greatest wound of wounds for Indigenous people is taking away our spirituality. And I think the systems that are there with, when we talk about racism and oppression, they're like brother and sister. And that brother and sister echoes colonialism, and we see it in action to this day in different ways. Reconciliation is not just about having good relationships with governments. It is about ending the oppressive, the colonial, and the racist policies that impact Indigenous people across Canada. And I know that I'm happy that the people that are here to be able to listen, just because I think standing with us, mourning with us, being allies, and remembering with us about our ancestors, about our children. That's the work that we need to do, is make sure we have the governments and other Canadians that are not aware of this issue to be able to make change. Every one of you that are here, I don't see you, but I hear you. I guess I'll start out and I can end with a thought. When I'm here, when I'm speaking to people, when I'm in different, whoever I'm talking to. The biggest room in the world is the room for improvement. And that improvement lies within ourselves, within our families, within our communities, within Ontario, within Canada, within the society. And that's the kind of conversation that we need to have. So thank you for this, Peter. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Sol. Suze, if I could have your comments, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for bringing us together, Peter. And I want to thank you, Michael, for the land acknowledgement, and thank my colleague Sol for your opening remarks. It's such a joy to have Sol and Peter as colleagues in the legislature. So as Peter said, my name is Suze Morrison. I'm the member of Provincial Parliament in Toronto Centre. I've grown up in Toronto Centre my whole life. And my grandfather was First Nations and did not go to residential schools, but was raised as child labor on a farm. And we don't know how he got there. We know he ran away when he was 16. And that's where our family tree stops. And, the practices of assimilation in this country worked for a lot of families. And there are a lot of people Indigenous people in urban communities that are still struggling with how to find a sense of identity and a sense of connection to culture and language and community and family, who have been displaced and assimilated as a result of residential schools, the 60s scoop, the millennial scoop, and the continued practice of child apprehension that continues on today. And in fact, we know that there are more children, Indigenous children, that have been apprehended by the state currently in care in Canada than there were at the height of the residential school system. So when we talk about, what this day tomorrow is supposed to mean, and what is Truth and Reconciliation Day, it's about knowing the history and committing not to repeat it. But we are repeating it, because children are still being taken from Indigenous children are still being taken from their families today through the child's welfare system. And there's still an urgent need for supports for a lot of those kids. to stay connected to culture and community and language, and particularly in urban centers. And I do want to take a moment and recognize the important role that the Friendship Centers play in urban communities to support not only the survivors of residential schools, but the young people and all of the community members. But tomorrow's about it, not just acknowledging the history, but recognizing that we all have a role as either Indigenous folks or allies to play in course correcting for a better future for Indigenous kids. That mean that those kids are growing up and know who they are and know where they come from and know who their family is and have good relationships with their family, that they have access to education, access to clean drinking water, access to healthy food, all of the things that any child in the richest country, in the wealthy country that we are, should reasonably have access to. And we know that that's still not the case. So we have a lot of work to do. And I think that a lot of people, particularly, settler and ally folks, have been asking themselves, what do we do? And I've been thinking about that a lot the last couple of days, because I've been, really frustrated, I think, on particularly on social medias. We've seen there's a lot going on with kind of how this first TRC day is rolling out. And it needs to be about more than putting on your orange shirt and performing, empty gestures. Please put on your orange shirt, but do more than that. It's important to take time tomorrow to actually read the TRC. I really hope that it's a day of education and reflection for people to really learn the history, read the report, read the calls to action, and find your place in accountability to those calls to action. Because what's interesting about the calls to action is that they're not just, I think when a lot of the times when, these reports are done, citizens often think, oh, that's the government's responsibility to implement those recommendations. And what's really interesting about the TRC is that there's a lot of calls to action in it that are targeted to industries or people or sectors, to the health sector, to the justice sector, to the education sector. And if you as a person have any accountability in any of the systems or sectors or communities or areas that those calls to action touch on, you have a personal line of accountability to implementing those calls to action. And so my ask to people, if they're looking for something to do, to engage, because they're grappling with this sense of, this very dark history and ongoing trauma and genocide, and your place in reckoning with that. That is my recommendation to you. Sit with that report, read the recommendations, and find your own line of accountability to implementing them. I think the other thing I would say is Indigenous people and communities are going through a lot of grief right now. And to be cautious of asking Indigenous people to educate you tomorrow. So your homework as non-Indigenous folks is to go and do some of that education on your own. Do some Googling on the histories. Head over to your local bookstore, pick up some books by some Indigenous authors. If you don't know where to start, ask some folks in the bookstore for some recommendations. Go on your social media accounts. Yes, Tanya Talaga, all our relations. It's a great one.
Thank you, Sol.
Thank you, Sol. Go onto all of your social media accounts and start following Indigenous people. Go find 10 Indigenous people to follow tomorrow and start quietly listening to them. But don't demand education from them, particularly as a lot of communities are going through grief. So that would be my ask and my homework to everyone that's watching tonight. to understand that you have a role of accountability to the calls to action in the TRC. And even if you don't, immediately find your home in some sort of accountability, your accountability then can be holding the different levels of government in Canada accountable. It can be things like writing your city councillors, your great MPP like Peter, your MPs, and demanding action on the things that do fall on those three different levels of government, and taking a piece of accountability that way. And then to educate yourselves and go and follow Indigenous voices on social media and broaden the voices that you have access to. So again, thank you, Peter, so much for bringing us together today. And that's my homework assignment to all of you.
Okay.
Peter, just quickly.
Go ahead, Sol.
So this book that I have, All Our Relations, is by Tanya Talega. But I just wanted to share this really quick. On page 185, it's on chapter 5. It's called We Are Not Going Anywhere. It starts off talking about this quiet riot. There's a student in there that I used to go to school with. It talks about how they rose against the staff because of all the strapping that was being done.
Whoa.
So there's a chapter in it that talks about it. And it's in this book, and then that's the school. That's the school I went to.
Oh, you're kidding?
It talks about that. That school I went to. It's called Stern Lake, but it's in this book. Yeah, so I just thought I'd share that.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Sol. And Suze, thank you for your presentation. All three of you. We seem to have a number of questions coming up. I'll just say before I go to the questions, we had two right off the bat about ceremonies tomorrow marking the Day of Truth and Reconciliation. Michael, you answered one of those questions, pointing out the event that's happening tomorrow at the Evergreen Brickworks at 11:30 a.m. And also Michael Garron Hospital will be holding events throughout the day. If that website was posted at the Q&A, but if anyone Googles Michael Garron Hospital, I think you'll find it pretty quickly. I'm going to start.
Peter, sorry, I also wanted to plug, I think there's a couple of other events going on. I just wanted to plug as well.
Yes,
if
go
folks
ahead.
are headed more into downtown tomorrow, I believe there's something happening at Yonge and Dundas Square around noon-ish.
Okay.
And I think if you're going to be more, maybe if you work in the West End, you're headed out that way. I believe there's an event in Dufferin Grove Park around 3 as well. So depending if you're out and about traveling the city tomorrow, those are a couple of other events that are going on.
Suze, thanks very much. I think we've got a pretty broad audience, so letting them know they've got a variety of options is definitely a plus. We've got quite a few questions, so I'm going to go to the questions from participants. And the first I have is, would it be important to end the Indian Act, and what can we do to advocate for that? Sol, I'm going to start with you on that, although Suze, you may also want to join in. But Sol, what's your commentary on that?
Certainly, thank you for the question. It is a very good question. And that piece of legislation, that piece of act law is one of the most colonial systems that are there. It's very controlling, and but I think over the years, for over 150 years, that's been in place, and that's what governs reserves right now. When we talk about reserves, on reserve, like say, for example, I'm from Northwestern Ontario all the way up to Hudson's Bay. And, I have 31 First Nations, I believe, and then any provision of services is federal responsibility, whether it's education, healthcare, housing, infrastructure, all that stuff. So I think it's important to be able to organize ourselves. We had our own self-governing systems that were in place before settlers arrived, and I think but we are still here, and I think it's we need to have that dialogue. And I think one of the things that's really critical is the I guess respecting the treaties. From where I am, where I grew up, I'm part of the Treaty Number 9 example. There are 11 numbered treaties across Canada, 1 to 11. And out of the numbered treaties, number 9 is the only treaty that has a province, in this case, Ontario, is a signatory to,
Okay.
whereby we share the benefits, share the resources of that treaty, and that has not happened. And I think that's one of the things I'm really like. I'm here for a reason at the provincial legislature to try to get them to honor that treaty, even though. So I think it's really important that we have to get ourselves ready too. And then I think that's one of the things that Indian Act has done is it has allowed for us not to rise. The strategic, chronic underfunding of programs we cannot rise. And it's, like when we talk about access to healthcare, access to housing, access to education, it's been limiting us. So we still need to be able to transform the systems of, we cannot do it all in one day. It's going to take some time to be able to step out of the Indian Act and to provide where we govern ourselves, whose laws would supersede? Is it First Nations? Is it the province, or is it the feds? And people always say it's always the colonial governments that are here, because we have our own inherent Indigenous laws that we have in place, and they don't recognize it. So we need to be able to have that discussion. But I think, but we need to do it in sectors, whether okay, let's do health, let's do education, let's do corrections. Like we would do that in those sections in different territories, right? Like we are at different stages across the country. We are many nations, and no one process would work. And I think again, it's about honoring the treaties. It's about that.
Thank you. And Suze, did you want to address that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a ton to add more than Sol has already said. I think, the only other piece I'd, add is that, one of the complicated pieces with, just, waving a wand and waving away the Indian Act is, as Sol was saying, the current governance structures of the individual communities are dictated currently by the Indian Act. But you have to remember that those governance structures were basically abolished in most communities, the traditional Indigenous governance in the nations, in the communities. And, there are some communities that have gone through the work of, reclaiming their traditional governance structures, whether we're looking like down in Six Nations is a really great local example where the traditional governance structure is being revived in that community. But in a lot of places, those traditional structures are not still standing. And so it's there, as Sol was saying, it's the communities need to be supported to rise up and in a way that creates a transition to allow the communities to thrive and be successful. And it's a complicated body of work, as Sol was saying, that the communities need to be supported to thrive, to come out of the oppression of the Indian Act. And I think just waving away a piece of legislation, if the supporting pieces are in place to actually, as Sol was saying, honor the treaties and make sure there's good health, good access to education, all of those pieces so that the communities are healthy and able to kind of move forward from the Indian Act. It's not as simple as just, legislating the Indian Act away.
Okay, no, fair enough. I'm going to go to the next question. And I'm not sure which of the two of you is most appropriate to respond. Is the subject of Indigenous peoples being taught in public and high schools as active curriculum at this point? Do either of you want to take that on?
Yeah,
Go ahead, Sol.
So I think it's so important that, that within the Ontario curriculum, that the history of the other Canada or residential schools, treaties, it's so important that it is taught across Canada, not just Ontario. It's important that, like me, I never learned about treaties. I never learned about residential schools. Even me, I learned about, Canada. I learned about Sir John A. Macdonald on how he was the first prime minister. I never learned that side of how he was an architect of residential schools to remove the Indian in that child. So I think it's so important that we learn that. And I think that's where the change is. The students, the children, they are the change because they should know the real history of what Canada was built upon, which is on racism, which is on oppression, which is on colonialism. And it's not all dark. There are good things too, because our, the teachings that we have, the ways of life that we have, that, settlers, other Canadians, Ontarians should be learning. And I think it's so important that we have that. It's unfortunate that, the provincial government had, canceled the Indigenous curriculum writing sessions back in 2018. And we lost 3 years already.
Yeah.
And so that's unacceptable. And I think it's people like yourselves, the people that are online. It's about being able to advocate, whether it's writing to your MP, writing to your school boards, writing to your MPPs about these issues. Get 3 people to join you and to write that letter. It's so important. It's again, as I said before, the biggest room in the world is the room for improvement, and that's all part of it. Education is key.
Sol, thank you for that. Suze, I'd like to try another question on you. Could you please comment on the federal court ruling today upholding the Human Rights Tribunal ruling about compensation for First Nations kids? And Suze, you'll start off. My suspicion, Sol, is you may want to have a word on this as well. But Suze, if you could start off, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really important ruling that came out today. And first and foremost, I want to thank Cindy Blackstock and the First Nations Caring Society for leading the work in this monumental legal fight. I think, one of the most upsetting things about this has been the federal government continuing to fight Indigenous kids in court and to appeal this ruling and continue to lie about doing it. We saw in the debates during the federal election, the Prime Minister stand up on that debate stage and say, we're not fighting Indigenous kids in court. Well, what did the ruling we have today show us? That's exactly what they were doing. That's exactly what they were doing. And they've been doing it for years. And what were they fighting? Well, they were fighting Jordan's principle and the government's responsibility to Jordan's principle. And if you don't know what Jordan's principle is, it's basically a legal principle that says no Indigenous child should go without any resource or support that any non-Indigenous child would have reasonable access to. And the case was started a little boy who needed extended home care supports to be able to go home and live in his community as he was dying. And this child spent, I believe it was 5 years, maybe I'm not sure if I got that quick part quite right. In hospital, instead of being able to go home to his community with his family, with the home care supports that he needed, that if he was a child who lived off reserve, he would have had access to. And the crux of it was the provincial government and the federal government ended up butting heads over whose responsibility it was to pay for a child's on reserve home care services. And neither one of them wanted to foot the bill. And so Jordan's principle basically says the Ministry of First Contact pays the bill, and the levels of government sorted out behind the scene, but no child should go without access to care services or any opportunity that any non-Indigenous child would have because of jurisdictional battles over who pays the bill when provincial services don't match up to what the federal government provides on reserve. And that's what the federal government was fighting in court. Their fiduciary responsibility to ensure that Indigenous kids on reserve don't have any less opportunity or access to any child that lives off reserve or any non-Indigenous child. And it's absolutely shameful. It's absolutely shameful. And then to play politics with these kids and stand up on a debate stage in the federal election and outright lie that the current Liberal government is taking these kids to court, I think was one of the most shameful things that came out of this federal election. So I am very, very glad to see the decision today. And I sincerely hope that the federal Liberal government steps up to the plate for once and starts doing right by these kids. Stop fighting Indigenous kids in court. Stop fighting residential school survivors in court. And stop performing reconciliation in non-meaningful ways. Right? Like I was saying earlier, put on your orange shirts, but do more than that. And that's just not what we're getting from the federal government right now. They've learned how to talk the right talk around reconciliation, but they don't know how to back it up with any meaningful action. And it's well past time that changes.
Suze, thank you. Sol, I think you wanted to get in on this as well. It's a very substantial development.
I think in one hand, this federal Liberal government, Trudeau and his government, are saying like, and they'll sit like this, and they'll say, you know what, we are about reconciliation. We're building relationships. We are, nation to nation talks, nation to nation relationships, and we care about Indigenous children across the country. But in the meantime, they'll sit over here and then they'll say, you know what? Meanwhile, they're fighting with courts, and within them courts with those orders. Like the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal had these orders, and meanwhile, the Canadian government was fighting it. It's a two-faced thing, and that's what racism looks like. That's what oppression looks like. That's what colonialism looks like. And to have these two-faced governments fight children for far too long, we've been treated like that. And I think and it's all about treating us as human beings, not savages, the way they called us before, and it's the actions still treats us like that. And so it was good to hear those, that they were going to keep those orders.
So thank you very much. We have quite a few questions, and we aren't going to go all night, so I'm going to try and pack them in as best I can. Maybe Sol, you can lead off on this because Suze, you've already touched on it to some extent. Can you speak to the role of corporations, non-governmental organizations, and other organizations in reconciliation? Specifically, how should they be enacting the 94 calls to action? Sol, if I could have you start on that.
Thank you for the question. Thank you for that. It's a really good question. I know to this day, there are businesses, organizations, NGOs that are giving their staff a holiday. And I believe that these type of organizations, businesses have a role in it, whether it's, when we talk about social corporate responsibilities of, the work that they do. A lot of people don't realize what happens in the backyard of Canada, in the backyard of Ontario. Some of the poverty I see when I fly to flying communities. And, I always talk about Peter and Suze, 26 years of boil water advisory in Niskandaga.
Yeah.
And I have these children that are growing up like that. And I have these 25-year-old people, children, I mean, not children, but young mothers that continue to live like that. And I think, they need to be able to be part of the solution. Work with, whether it's NGOs, whether it's First Nation organizations, whether it's, governments, to make sure that they are part of the solution. They have a big role. There is opportunity there. And sometimes I think that sometimes organizations do not have that opportunity or do not know how to be involved. So if I make a post, something about, like say, there might be a young family that's living in a truck. It's happening today in my riding, in the First Nation community. She has a 3-year-old boy, and and they live in a truck and they go cook in different homes, whatever is available to shower. If I tell that story, there's people that want to donate, but I cannot facilitate that. And I think we need businesses to be able to help the, not just one family, but others, right? There's so much that could be done.
Sol, thank you for that. I want to go to another question, and it arises out of a comment. We talked earlier about events tomorrow to commemorate the Day of Truth and Reconciliation. And one person wrote, Ford didn't give us a day off tomorrow. We can't even go to any of the events. Suze, both you and Sol put out a statement on this, I believe, talking about the Ford government's refusal to actually recognize this day in the way that's meant to be recognized. Do you want to start off with commentary on that, Suze?
Yeah, I do. I think it's a pretty shameful move. The scale of the grief and the mourning that has been taking place for Indigenous communities and Canadians is massive. And for Ford to say, your grief isn't worth the time, I think sends a pretty strong message that he doesn't think it's his job to respond or create the space that enable the space that people and communities need to grieve. I think it comes down to he was playing petty political games, and he has been in hiding for months. I think largely as a result of his inaction on the COVID-19 crisis. And he prorogued the legislature to duck and cover politically from the people of Ontario while he went into hiding. And he didn't care enough about Indigenous people and the importance of this day to recall the legislature and work with the opposition to get this done in time. He just didn't want to show up to work and face the scrutiny of the people of Ontario for a number of reasons in order to actually get the legislation in place to create a statutory day off for September 30th. And I think that's absolutely shameful.
Suze, thank you for that. I know, Sol, you've spoken out on this as well. If you wouldn't mind talking to that, but I also want to just slip one more question in as we get close to winding up. We were asked, thank you all for this necessary and educational session. We allies would like to understand how we can help with multi-generational trauma caused by the residential schools with Indigenous kids growing up in Ontario today. Now, Suze, you've already put out homework for people, and it's good homework. Read the recommendations and look at how you can implement them in your lives. But Sol, if you could speak directly to the failure to make tomorrow a holiday of memorial, of reflection, and this question of how people would help with dealing with the multi-generational trauma, that would be very useful.
Yeah, it's I think for this government, it is a missed opportunity. They were way offside on their decision not to. Ford government and Doug Ford and Minister Rickford, they're not allies to Indigenous people. They are not our friends. They are wolves in sheep's clothing. They may do something little, like an announcement, like say the curriculum today, they did that. It's almost like they're doing this to themselves, because incremental change within the systems perpetuate the colonialism, the oppression. Incremental change perpetuates the crisis in our communities. And when they address those little things that may look like as if they're doing something without really doing anything, it just makes them look as if they're doing something without talking about the fundamental changes that are needed, such as talking about treaties, talking about land claims, talking about self-determination, sovereignty. Those are the discussions we need to be able to have. Programs and services and funding perpetuate these things, perpetuate the crisis, perpetuate the oppression. And I think it's so important that, there's one movie, I think it's called Rabbit Proof Fence. It's about Indian residential school in Australia. And that might be something, worthwhile, just to, see it's about residential school, but in a different country, but it's the same thing. And I think, the intergenerational trauma, we face it every day. That's why we see the overrepresentation of the justice system, the correctional system of Indigenous people there. When we see the overrepresentation of children within the child welfare systems. And I think there is so much. I just had there's a community in my riding, there's a 13-year-old young girl that died by suicide just a few days ago. And that's the result of that. And it's just not acceptable anymore. And I think that's, we need to be able to bring these truth-telling stories, amplify these voices.
Thank you very much. We're coming close to wrapping up, but Suze, you had mentioned in your opening remarks, and I have a question about this, that the number of children in the child welfare system, I'll say that in quotes, is greater now than the number of children who were in residential schools, and I may have misheard you. Could you talk about the children, First Nations children currently in care and the issues that you're concerned about there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're continuing to see overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in care. And, this is a result of, as Sol was saying, intergenerational trauma. When we had, kids come out of residential school, the trauma that they were carrying was then passed down to their kids and their grandkids. And, through the result of then layering child apprehension, generations of child apprehension, there are a lot of broken families. And today, we have a massive, massive overrepresentation of Indigenous youth that have been apprehended from their families in the child welfare system. And there's been a lot of work that has gone on with First Nations across Ontario and across Canada to start moving to, Indigenous-led care. And things like customary care and ensuring that kids are able to stay with extended family and stay in their communities and stay connected to culture. But when a child is apprehended from their family, they're not just apprehended into child welfare, they're losing their connection to culture and to community and to their language and to their family. And it's active genocide that is still happening today through the overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in the child welfare system, and it has to stop. But when you look at, it's not just intergenerational trauma, it's poverty. It's the forced poverty in so many communities. Is a family going to pass a CAS visit if there's no clean drinking water in the home? If there's not enough food in the cupboards? At the end of the day, you cannot disconnect the forced poverty from the ongoing removal and apprehension of Indigenous kids that are massively overrepresented in the child welfare system. And many organizations have cited that there are now more kids in care now than there were at the height of the residential school system. And we have
That's what you said.
Yeah, we have to reckon with that. Indigenous kids have a right to their culture and languages and family and communities. And apprehension just further perpetuates the intergenerational trauma that we have seen through residential schools, the 60 scoop and the millennial scoop.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that clarification that addresses the question that was asked earlier. I want to say to the two of you, we've just got a few minutes before we wrap up, and I appreciate it if we could have some closing words. You've covered a lot of ground this evening, and I'm appreciative, and I think everyone who's been watching is very appreciative. Are there things that you want to leave people with who've been part of tonight's session? Sol, I'll start with you, and Suze, I'll wrap up with you.
Thank you, Peter. I think, thank you for the people that are here. We are thankful. I thank you very much for being here, listening. I don't know your names. I don't know your faces, but you are here. You are here to listen. You are here to learn. You are here to hear us. And I think it's an opportunity as well to be able to make change. You are the change. And your friends, your family, they are part of this change. You are part of the allyship that Indigenous people need in this country, in this province. And, you know, that's what we need as Indigenous people, especially on the eve of the first National TRC Day, but also Orange Shirt Day. And then I think it's really important that, you know, to accept the truth that this really happened. If you don't believe or if you don't accept that truth, you are part of the problem. But I think tomorrow is a day to reflect. It's a day to honor our children, honor our ancestors. And I think, as I said before, genocide is a big deal. If 20,000 non-Indigenous children died after being stolen forcibly from their parents and their communities, their families, we would not be having this debate. We would not be having this discussion. And I think it's important when your child is going to school tomorrow, if your nieces, your grandkids, just imagine if they never came back. And that's what we're dealing with. And I think that's why we need that allyship, and we need that, you know, to work with us, to honor them. So those are my closing comments. Be good.
Thank you very much, Sol. Suze, if we could have some closing comments from you as well, please.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. You know, I think I just, again, want to reiterate, you know, a few of the pieces that I said at the beginning, and that's, you know, to remember that Indigenous people and communities are hurting right now and feeling a lot of grief, a lot of trauma. And, you know, I keep thinking about a residential school survivor that Sol and I had a chance to meet down in Six Nations earlier. I think it was in the summer. And she sat and she spoke to us a long time about her experiences in the Mushel, just a residential school there, just outside of Six Nations. And she talked about how her whole life she had carried around this coat of grief and shame about her experiences in the residential school. And she said, you know, I learned to take that coat of grief and shame off as she went on her healing journey and was finally able to start talking about what had happened to her in the Mushel, and talking about her experiences and you know, not blaming herself and carrying that guilt and shame over what happened to her. And she said, I've taken that heavy coat of guilt and shame off, but now it's time for Canada to wear it. And I say that because I share that story because, you know, reconciliation isn't supposed to feel good. And if whatever you're doing tomorrow is to make yourself feel better as an ally, I might suggest you're probably doing it wrong. Reconciliation means that Canada and Canadians have to start wearing that heavy coat of guilt and shame that the survivors have been carrying around on their shoulders for far too long. And if you are turning and expecting Indigenous people, you know, in your life, or that, you know where you're reaching out to, maybe on social media or, you know, however you're reaching out, you know, and if you're relying on those people that are processing a lot of grief and trauma in this moment to do the labor of educating you or of making you feel better or of telling you what to do, that, you know, you need to give space to people to go through the grief and the trauma that communities are going through, and take up some responsibility to educate yourself and to take on the emotional labor of educating yourself, of learning the history, and of carrying part of Canada's guilt and shame over this. And that's a heavy ask, but, you know, allyship can't be performative. And this is where the heavy lifting is going to come in.
Suze, thank you very much for that. We're going to wrap up. I want to thank again Michael Chena for leading us off today. Suze, Sol, for your insights, for your explanations, very, very useful. I want to thank my staff, Louise, Elaine, Rob, who've been behind the scenes pulling everything together. Wouldn't have functioned without you. And to all of you who joined us this evening, many, many thanks. If we're going to actually have an impact in Canada, if people are going to realize the truth, which I think is the first step, and then actually bring about reconciliation, making the wrong right, then we're going to need millions of people to understand and to act. And those of you who joined us tonight are part of that process of understanding and acting. Thank you all. Have a good evening. And tomorrow, a day of reflection, a day of thought. Thanks. Take care.